Now, Washington Mornings on the Mall. 105.9 FM. And AM 630. WMAL.
This has to stop. When people say they don't want to work with the United States because they can't trust us to keep a secret, that's serious.
That's Democrat Dianne Feinstein talking about the leaks that have occurred lately about a whole bunch of different things and how concerning it is. Peter Brooks joins us now, Senior Fellow, National Security Affairs of the Heritage Foundation, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and former CIA official as well.
An all-around good guy.
Peter, good morning. How are you?
Good morning.
So, I guess the first question is, do we have any idea who is leaking this? Is it coming from the White House? Is it coming from the military? Or is it a combination of both?
It's hard to say, and that's one of the things that the investigations should run down. Some of the stuff seems very, very sensitive and, perhaps came out of the highest levels of the government because the access would have been very, very limited. But it's hard to say. I mean, some of this could be even second or third-hand information. The problem is that this is national security information, and it shouldn't be leaked to the public.
Right. Now, because there are only a few people that may have known this, if it was that high of information, does that make it easier to find out who did it?
Not necessarily, because you have to, the journalists do not have to disclose their sources. I mean, Brian Wilson's probably better, knows more about that than I do, certainly. But that's the issue here, is that Sanger, who was responsible for the writings in the New York Times on the Stuxnet, I don't believe, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't believe that he has to divulge his sources of that information.
Although I do remember some people from the New York Times and Tim Ruster being called in the Scooter Libby trial to talk about exactly what they had been talking about with some officials.
I mean, it used to be in the old days that you got a lot of protection as a reporter if you had a secret source that you didn't want to reveal, but there have been cases after case after case of late where the right of a reporter to protect his source has been challenged.
I agree with that, but like I said, I'm not a lawyer on that in that regard. And Senator Feinstein yesterday in the presser talked a little bit about this, about perhaps changing the laws that would not protect or would not allow reporters or correspondents to protect their sources in this case, especially on these high-level national security cases.
But I think what bothers most people about this is that the leak may have been what it was motivated by.
Right.
I mean, was it motivated by somebody who just wanted to tell an interesting story or thought there was an interesting thing that the public should know, or was it motivated to make the president's political operation, to make it look better?
Well, that would be the purpose of the investigation, and also to get the person who potentially broke the law here. I mean, there are laws about this sort of stuff. But yeah, I mean, there's a real concern, and I wrote about this in my column in the New York Post this week, is that this was for purely political purposes, that this was meant to burnish the president's national security credentials. And this Stuxnet thing about the Iranian computer virus isn't the first one. It goes back, to Osama bin Laden, the drone, the Yemeni bomber case. I mean, and that's the real concern here, but that intent is probably pretty hard to run down.
There's a lot of information in that particular article. So, you've been around Washington. Do you have any faith in the ability to actually track down who these people are or who this person is?
Well, there have been some things going on here. It can be very, very difficult, and if somebody is caught, there can be a deterrent effect to others from doing this. But I think just the fact that people on Congress on both sides of the aisle are very unhappy about this should hopefully shut down future leaks. But unfortunately, the cow's already left the barn on some of this stuff.
Shouldn't the president or certainly the Secretary of Defense stand up and either through a press conference or through some type of official outing, or perhaps maybe not an official outing, but make it clear this stuff needs to end, period, right now?
Yeah, the guy who did this, what was a stand-up guy about this, was Bob Gates, remember?
Yes.
Yep.
The former Secretary of Defense, and there's all sorts of stories out there now about what he said after the Osama bin Laden raid, but he came out publicly shortly after the Osama bin Laden raid about a year ago and said, hey, we all agreed we weren't going to discuss any of these operational details about bin Laden, and that fell apart within a few hours. And that's a real problem. So you do need people to be stand-up sort of folks, get out there and say this sort of behavior is unacceptable, and regardless of if there should be internal investigations as well regarding this information, not just something from a special prosecutor or some sort of other investigation.
But what you're hearing is condemnation coming from Dianne Feinstein, who's a chairman of the Intelligence Committee. You hear it coming from John Kerry, who's on foreign relations. You hear it from John McCain, who thinks it's political, and the Democrats don't think it is, but he thinks it is. What you don't hear is you don't hear anything from the Secretary of Defense. You don't hear anything from the director of the CIA. You don't hear those people, voicing concern. Now, they may be voicing concern privately, but they're certainly not doing publicly. What are we to draw from that?
Well, that's hard to say. Hopefully things are being said internally. There may be memos flying around internally talking about this sort of thing. And, of course, these are executive branch officials, Brian, right? Mm-hmm. And so they're going to hew to what the White House wants to be said. And the White House, from what I can tell, seems to be pushing back on this, especially people who are attributing political motivations to these leaks. But the fact of the matter is this really hurts us. It's not just a political issue. People aren't going to want to work with us. It puts our troops and our intelligence officers deeper in harm's way. The Iranians now, I think, are going to come back, and who knows what sort of critical infrastructure in the United States is in their crosshairs now. There's certainly no cyber slouch. I thought it was interesting, this thing about the Iranian thing getting out when we're trying to get them to come to the table on peaceful diplomatic negotiations over their nuclear program. I can't imagine now that they're going to be very happy when they can, attribute this to us without very little, guesswork. I mean, we can't lecture others on their cyber activity. The Chinese are all over the place doing things. So I don't see any upside to this whatsoever. And like I said, it's a real national security issue.
Yeah, stay tuned. We're not done with this one yet. Peter Brooks, always good to have you. Appreciate you joining us here from the Heritage Foundation.